Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hey, I'm Congressman Bill Johnson, and I represent Eastern and Southeastern Ohio. Thank you for attending today's briefing. The UXO Demining Caucus here in the House organized today's activities, and I'm very proud to co-chair that caucus with my colleague and friend, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who unfortunately can't be with us today. As some of you know, June 20th was World Refugee Day, on which we recognize the 26 million people who have been forced to flee their homes due to conflict. Accordingly, today's discussion focuses on the impact conflicts have on individuals and communities, and how threats from explosive ammunitions prevent people displaced as a result of the conflicts from returning home and rebuilding their lives. Across the globe, conflicts have forced millions of people from their homes. According to the UN, at the end of 2021, a total of 89.3 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or other events seriously disturbing public order. Unfortunately, this figure is likely to be considerably higher in 2022, given the scale of the invasion and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and the ongoing instability in Afghanistan. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reports that approximately 70% of refugees worldwide originated from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, while 44% of internally displaced people are in Syria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. However, many other countries, including Iraq and Sri Lanka, have seen significant numbers of displaced people. And as I've stated before, and we all know, the devastation of war doesn't cease once the conflict has ended, especially for the local populations whose land is unsafe and unusable due to unexploded ordnance and landmines. Rockets and mortars line streets while schools, homes, and farmlands are filled with bombs. For instance, Sri Lanka's civil war concluded in 2009, and yet organizations including the Halo Trust and MAG are still assisting in the painstaking work of clearing landmines and unexploded ordnance so that displaced Sri Lankans can return home to safe and usable land. Only after removing these hazards can families safely return and rebuild their lives. So now let me introduce our distinguished panel for today. Catherine Shaw is the program manager for grants and liaison with MAG in Iraq. She has worked with MAG since 2018, and prior to joining the Iraq program, she worked with MAG in South Sudan. Catherine has over 5 years of experience in the humanitarian mine action sector. Simon Conway is the head of the program development for Halo Trust and has just returned from visiting Ukraine. Simon worked for Halo from 1998 to 2004 in Cambodia, Kosovo, Abkhazia, Eritrea, and Sri Lanka. From 2004 to 2008, he was the director of landmine action and a co-chair of the Cluster Munition Coalition, and he rejoined Halo in 2013. Solomon, or Saul for short, Black, serves as the program's branch chief for Africa, Europe, and the Near East in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement at the U.S. Department of State. In this role, Saul leads a team responsible for designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating conventional weapons destruction programs with an annual budget of over $100 million that advance U.S. foreign policy goals across Africa, Europe, and the Near East. I'm going to have to run because votes have been called, but I want to turn it over to Katie Shaw for her remarks, and then we'll go right straight through the panel from Simon to Saul, and Laura Wilson will handle Q&A here from my office. But thank you all for joining us today. Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative Johnson. Hi, I'm Catherine Shaw, or Katie for short. I am the program manager with Mines Advisory Group based in Erbil, Iraq. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for this invitation today. Just to give some brief background about us, MAG has worked in Iraq since 1992, and the US government has funded MAG since the end of about 2002, and currently we receive funding from the US government through the State Department's Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement, USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and the DoD's Humanitarian Demining and R&D program, which together makes up about half of our current annual budget. So according to UNHCR, and as mentioned, there are over 26 million refugees today. In addition, there are another 50 million people globally who are internally displaced in their own country. In Iraq, there are currently approximately 330,000 refugees, according to ACAPS, who are primarily from Syria, and 1.2 million Iraqis who are currently internally displaced. Today, I'm going to talk about how the MAG Iraq program has responded to the needs of refugees and IDPs since about 2014, and how the response has evolved over time, the key role that support from the United States has played in this response, and I hope that this information can be helpful to inform the response to other crises throughout different phases of their recovery. So could we get the slides up, please? Okay, you can go to the next slide. When conflict forces people to seek refuge elsewhere, they often must cross hazardous areas and battlefields, transiting through unknown areas, possibly on foot. They might settle in areas that they are unfamiliar with, which might be contaminated by explosive ordnance from the current conflict or from past conflicts. Their homelands will also likely be contaminated. Airdrop bombs may fail to explode. Approximately 20% of all munitions fail to function as designed, and the percentage is even higher for submunitions or cluster bombs. Houses and other buildings might be booby-trapped, and agricultural fields may be mined. The infrastructure will likely be destroyed, preventing the delivery of public services. All of these factors can make it difficult for people to return home even after the fighting has stopped. Next slide, please. So following the start of the Syrian refugee crisis, there was an influx of Syrian refugees coming from across the border into Iraqi Kurdistan, where MAG worked at the time, and which was one of the most mine-contaminated areas in the world, or is one of the most mine-contaminated areas in the world. MAG provided explosive ordnance risk education to refugees, including updating its lesson plans, so that they also included the type of contamination found in Syria, so that refugees would be aware of the dangers both in where they were currently displaced to in Iraq and when returning home. Next slide, please. Now, starting in 2014, as you probably remember, there was the large takeover of large areas of territory by ISIS, which caused just absolutely horrific levels of death and suffering and led to the widespread displacement of Iraqi civilians. During this conflict, in total, over 6 million people were internally displaced at one point or another between 2014 and now, according to the latest humanitarian needs overview. Next slide. Therefore, in 2014, when ISIS first started taking over parts of Iraq, 47% of IDPs originated from Nineveh Governorate, according to the IOM, where MAG later began operations. This includes many of the Yazidi people who were brutally persecuted by ISIS in the early phases of the crisis. At the time, MAG's internal data found that an increasing number of accidents were taking place as people were fleeing or returning to their homes, and the accidents were caused by ISIS improvised mines and booby traps. And in a further assessment, MAG found that the majority of people who were surveyed were not aware of what explosive ordnance looks like, the dangers posed, or how to stay safe. So at the outset of this crisis in around 2014, MAG continued its response in, oh, I'm sorry, could you please go to the next slide? MAG continued its response in the IDP camps in the Kurdistan region, and many of these camps had been established in areas which were not already confirmed as free from explosive ordnance or were located in close proximity to contamination. So MAG conducted clearance to allow IDP camps to expand, and MAG also provided risk awareness training to other aid workers, especially field staff whose work would take them into contaminated villages. Next slide, please. After the subdistricts of Sununi, Zumar, and Rabia in Nineveh Governorate were liberated from the hold of ISIS, MAG was the first organization to conduct contamination and damage assessments in 2015 in order to inform future clearance prioritization and the safe delivery of humanitarian aid. From 2015 to 2018, MAG scaled up its program in Iraq rapidly to respond to the contamination in liberated areas, including contamination from improvised mines. Next slide, please. The US government has provided substantial support to MAG during this time so that we could scale up our response to this crisis. US government funding was especially instrumental in the opening of a new base in Sinjar district in early 2016, and an additional scale up of activities across Nineveh Governorate in 2018. During this initial scale up, MAG was also able to increase the number of women employed in technical roles, especially as deminers, many of whom were hired from the Yazidi community in Sinjar. And since the success of hiring so many women as deminers in Sinjar, when possible, MAG has been able to build on this success, hiring women in Talafar, Mosul, and Sulaymaniyah with funding from other donors. Next slide. So then as the stage of the crisis progresses, around November 2017, after the liberation of Mosul, the number of returnees began to exceed the number of IDPs. The number of people going home was more than the number of people leaving. So while explosive ordnance does stop some people from returning to their home districts, there's a multitude of push and pull factors. And some people return to areas that are still contaminated. They might end up living in their yards or with relatives if their own homes are too damaged or contaminated with explosive ordnance. One of the elders of a town called Rambusi in Sinjar, who was interviewed by MAG, had initially fled to Sinjar Mountain. And he told us that his house had been turned into a workshop by ISIS to manufacture IEDs. And when he returned home, he had to stay with his relatives because in his house, ISIS had left behind barrels and toxic chemicals and rockets. But it's not just houses that are contaminated. ISIS laid rows of improvised mines surrounding the town of Rambusi in Sinjar. And in addition, there is an extensive and very densely contaminated mine belt that was laid surrounding Mosul in an area known as Nineveh Plains, which had long been considered Iraq's breadbasket. And this mine belt is blocking land vital for farming and shepherding and essential for livelihoods in rural Iraq. And this is one of the areas MAG is clearing up to today. Next slide, please. So a 2018 study by REACH in Sinjar found that there were only a limited number of livelihoods opportunities in the area, and that at the time agricultural work was restricted due to the fear of explosive hazards. In addition, it also highlighted that the lack of public services such as water, schools, and healthcare was a major barrier to returns. In Mosul, residents have also emphasized the importance of schools being opened in order for those people to return, and Mine Action plays an important role in facilitating the physical rehabilitation of structures for such services. When interviewed for an external research study, community members from Borak village in Sinjar frequently emphasized the importance of MAG's work. In Borak, Mine Action has cleared homes and it has contributed to improving the livelihoods of improving livelihoods through the clearance of businesses and shops and roads, allowing for the expansion of economic activity. UNDP explicitly stated during this evaluation that the work that they had conducted in Borak, including installing electricity cables, wells, and restoring 2 schools and a primary healthcare center, would not have happened without survey and clearance work happening first. Clearance can benefit locations that were affected by past conflicts as well. For example, people who were displaced from Qadir Karam in 1987 due to the conflict between Iraqi army and the Peshmerga were then forced to leave the village by Saddam Hussein's policy. MAG has cleared a number of tasks in the sub-district so that people can return, and most recently, land that MAG has cleared will be used to build a power station later this year. Next slide, please. At the beginning of this year, the vast majority of people who had been displaced since 2014, about 4.9 million people, have returned to their home districts. In Sinjar, MAG's survey and clearance activities have paved the way for a number of projects to support these returnees. Clearance has enabled an NGO, Nadia's initiative, to build a school, clinic, and a market in Rambusi village. MAG has also conducted rubble removal in the village of Dogri to allow UN Habitat to build 95 homes that have now been returned to their owners. In Talafar and Mosul districts, MAG has conducted non-technical survey to identify if there were any hazards that would affect an ICRC water pipeline project. In Tulaban village of Hamdaniya, when MAG first began work in the village, there were only 9 families living there. By 2021, there were 580 families, 2 schools had opened, and infrastructure projects were being completed. MAG's work has also supported a number of smaller projects, for example, the clearance of picnic areas to allow communities to get back to a normal life. In the village of Zara Khatun Kabir, children are now playing on land that's safe, and farmers are able to go into their fields. Going forward, MAG's work in these liberated areas will focus on continuing to create an enabling environment for durable solutions for IDPs and improving livelihoods opportunities. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, let's next go to Simon.
Thank you. If we could have the slides back, please, Kristen. Hello there. I'm Simon Conway with the Halo Trust. I want to just, first of all, say thanks to Congressman Johnson for arranging this briefing. I've just returned from Ukraine, where I spent a couple of weeks out with survey teams working to the west of Kyiv. And I thought that I'd talk to you about what I saw, about the impact that landmines and other explosive remnants are having on people as they rush back to their homes from areas that the Russian army has now left. And also to describe, in a sense, how that's going to influence the response to the presence of explosive ordnance in Ukraine in the future. So first of all, just to give a little bit of background about Halo in Ukraine, we've been operational in Ukraine since 2015, working on the line of contact in the Donbass, and most of our staff are from either from the Kramatorsk area or from Mariupol. We had 400 staff at the start of the conflict. We rapidly moved them west, away from what is now being, fiercely fought over, and got most of our equipment out and reconstituted ourselves to respond to this current phase of the conflict. And we've received the support of a number of countries to do so, including very substantial support from the US government through the Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement. And we're looking to expand possibly up to as many as 1,000 staff by the end of this year. So just to talk specifically about what I saw, I was working to the west of Kyiv in communities just that bit further west from Bucha and Irpin, the two towns that got a lot of attention because of the way the Russians behaved when they were there. So I was in communities that were contested, communities that had been occupied by Russian forces, and communities that had been shelled during the conflict. So the first slide there shows a minibus that was being driven by 3 volunteers, and it was full of aid supplies, mostly tins and jam jars that were being delivered by local volunteers to some of the elderly who were in some of these communities in a little village called Andriivka. They took a track adjacent to a field, and you can see the field behind the minibus has already been cultivated. They drove down that truck and hit an anti-tank mine. An anti-tank mine or anti-vehicle mine, we're talking about anything between about 18 and 20 pounds of high explosive. And that detonated under the wheel, one of the front wheels of the minibus, and the 3 volunteers died. And that's fairly typical of what I saw when I was in Ukraine. And the statistics back that up. At the moment, from the known recorded statistics, between 59 and 60% of casualties are being caused by anti-tank mines that were left behind. And although one has gone off on that track, we don't tend to find them on their own. We tend to find others with them. So we will have to check that track to see if there are other anti-tank mines. And again, it's no longer being used by vehicles as a result of that accident. And this happened pretty soon after the Russians left the village of Andriivka. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a lorry driver called Vadim standing in front of the remains of the truck he was driving. I took that photo last Monday on the 14th of June, and I had been on the site a couple of hours after he drove over an anti-tank mine the previous Friday on the 10th of June. So he was delivering agricultural supplies again on a track. There's a lot of tracks in this area. There are definitely tarmac roads, but a lot of the connections between the villages, and certainly from the farms to the tarmac roads, are on sandy tracks. He was driving building supplies, as I said, and he was lucky in that the rear right wheel of the truck hit an anti-tank mine. It detonated. The whole truck caught fire. By the time when we got there, they were burning. The rubber in the tires was burning. He had been thrown out and actually was okay. We took him back there 4 days later. I mean, the tragedy there is he's lost his job, so he doesn't own the truck. The owner of the truck has lost a vehicle, but that no longer has a job, and this is going to be a significant problem when we need to actually, when farmers in Ukraine need to deliver food, not just to Ukrainians, but to the rest of the world, is actually transporting grain and other agricultural produce across the farms is going to be a significant problem. And again, that was one anti-tank mine. Another one was found close by, but with no reason, we certainly think that there may be others nearby. And the next slide, please. And there you go. There's a tractor. It's a tractor owned by a big agricultural company called Harvest that lease land from the local villagers. There was a Russian position in the tree line there on the left. They laid anti-tank mines forward of their position. After they'd left, the agricultural company brought the tractor in, and it went over an anti-tank mine and destroyed itself. Obviously, that's having a significant impact on the ability of these big farming companies to actually cultivate the land and produce the food that the rest of the world so desperately needs. The pressure on them actually is really significant. On the 9th of June, this tractor, I took the photo a few days before that. This tractor was picked up by a crane, put on the back of a flatbed truck and driven away. And on the 10th, there was another tractor in the field ploughing. So we had to go out, walk out across the field and say to the tractor driver, look, can you at least leave part of this area clear, because we need to check it. There may be more anti-tank mines. So there's clearly, from these big companies, a lot of pressure on the contractor drivers to get to plow the land. And again, this guy was lucky. He got blown out of the cab, sustained minor injuries, but is back at work. I spoke with him with one of my colleagues last week. And the next slide, please. So this, again, in the same area, a little village called Korolivka. There are two women there. Elena, who is Elena was on the left, was born in 1941. So when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, so she was born in war. With her daughter Ludmila. She's got a garden behind her house, and then a field behind that. And on the right there, you can see a cluster munition carrier rocket. That's an Uragan, which in Russian is hurricane, and it has 30 submunitions in it, like peas in a pod. And the rocket breaks open in the air and scatters the submunitions across a large area, cover several football fields. We were out surveying, we found a number of craters. We certainly didn't find 30 craters. So there are likely to be more unexploded submunitions in the grass there. And we also know from experience of clearance that they burrow underground. So there are likely to be more submunitions burrowed under the ground. And they then may get turned up as the land is cultivated. If Elena is planting potatoes or whatever else, she'll be out in there turning the soil, and that presents a significant risk to her. And the number of casualties thus far from cluster munitions, I think it's about 8 to 9% of recorded casualties from cluster munitions. And then the final slide it shows some Grad rockets. These are were in common use around Kyiv. In this case, you can see launch tubes with the rockets just sticking out the end there of each tube. A Grad rocket system will have 40 rocket tubes on the back of a vehicle, and it can fire all 40 of them in about 20 seconds. Hence it's called Grad, which means hailstorm. We found an awful lot of these lying in fields, lying in people's gardens, lying in the villages themselves, particularly in buildings. They've taken out a lot of buildings. So that's a sort of bit of an overview of the kind of weapon systems that I saw, and it certainly, I think, it will help us to develop a response, particularly as we focus on, what to do about anti-tank mines. We already have teams finding anti-tank mines around Kyiv. They are using detectors to find them and then excavate tank mines in the areas where there have been accidents or where we've had intelligence to suggest anti-tank mines are present. And we're also bringing in big mechanical diggers so that we can start to dig up anti-tank mines and thereby speed up the process, but also reduce the risk to the deminers themselves. And then again, we're looking at methods of clearing using battle area clearance to find, and particular types of detectors to find subsurface cluster munitions. And then finally, we're training explosive ordnance disposal teams to deal with all of the ordnance that as a result of the shelling that didn't go off. And as Katie said earlier, we tend to see very high failure rates on these munitions. Particularly, a lot of them are old Soviet era munitions with high failure rates. So we're doing that. We have, because there's restrictions on men traveling abroad, we've been sending women, particularly to Kosovo, where they've been getting explosive ordnance disposal training, and clearly there's less likelihood of them being called up. So a lot of our ramped up response to this considerable threat has been women who've been very eager to join. And that's it from me.
Great, thank you, Simon. Next, we'll turn to Saul Black from the State Department.
Hey, thank you very much, Laura. Thanks you everyone for being with us today. I'd like to start by just thanking the UXO Caucus for its leadership and highlighting the negative impact that landmines and explosive remnants of war play impacting civilians around the world. I'd also like to thank Simon and Katie for the selfless and outstanding work that HALO and MAG do. My office, the Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement, provides a significant amount of funding to these organizations, and they're out there on the front lines doing this important work, keeping people alive, making sure people have access to basic services. So hats off to them. As my colleagues noted, these deadly hazards pose a direct threat to communities displaced by conflict, as well as block access to critical infrastructure, basic services, and economic development opportunities long after conflicts have ended. Addressing these hazards is essential for advancing a wide range of U.S. foreign policy priorities related to security, stability, economic development, conservation, and food security. Right off the top, I'd like to start by highlighting that the United States is a global leader in landmine clearance and conventional weapons destruction. Since 1993, the U.S. has invested more than $4.2 billion to survey and clear landmines and explosive remnants of war across the globe, as well as deliver explosive ordnance risk education and help our partners to safely and securely manage small arms, light weapons, and ammunition in more than 100 countries. In 2021 alone, the United States invested more than $265 million in conventional weapons destruction in 62 countries. As we've seen over the past decade, conflict doesn't just impact the warring parties. Rather, conflicts leave differing levels of landmine contamination and UXO contamination in their wake that can impact every person in every segment of a society in one way or another. As recent and ongoing conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Ukraine have highlighted, mines and UXO can block access to basic services, associated critical infrastructure, hospitals, schools, roads, railways, homes, farmlands, businesses, and more. Explosive hazards pose a very real threat to refugees and displaced communities at every stage of their journey. Once an individual or group is forced to flee their homes, they're subjected to the threat of landmines and UXO during their journey to safety. Crossing the front lines of any conflict increases one's chance of encountering these explosive hazards. After refugees escape the immediate threat of war, as well as the associated explosive hazards in their own country, many are forced to travel through former conflict zones or traverse borders that have previously been mined. An unfortunate recent example of how dangerous this can be happened just last March 2021. One migrant was killed and several others were wounded by a landmine in Croatia near the border with Bosnia. And this is a very popular route from people from South Asia and the Middle East trying to get into the EU. This was not the first accident that's happened with migrants using this route, and will almost certainly not be the last. Life as a refugee can be very hard, and a wide range of factors, as Katie mentioned, kind of shape people's decisions to return after a conflict. While a refugee's journey out of the conflict zone is always very difficult, returning is even more dangerous because people are returning to an environment that has changed significantly since they were there last. Refugees face a myriad of challenges when attempting to return to their homes and rebuild their lives, including access to basic services, shelter, protection, and economic opportunities. As recent and ongoing conflicts have shown us, landmines and explosive hazards can have a direct impact in each of these spaces and create what seems like a never-ending rotation of challenges intended to keep refugees from rebuilding their lives safely. Returning after a conflict can be a dangerous endeavor. For example, let's take a quick look at Raqqa, Syria. Once ISIS's de facto capital, Raqqa was liberated from ISIS in October 2017. By December 2018, local stabilization actors, many of who were operating with support from the U.S. government, had began providing some basic services. And as a result of this, a steady flow of displaced families began to return to Raqqa. Once in Raqqa, these returning communities found that their homes, schools, businesses, and land had been mined and booby-trapped by ISIS. During December 2017, local authorities and mine action actors recorded 179 landmine and explosive hazard related casualties in Raqqa alone. Right now, I'd like to drill down a little bit on the threats that refugees faced in Iraq and Syria specifically, as this is an area where the U.S. has provided a significant amount of assistance in recent years. And then I'm going to jump down and speak quickly on Ukraine. In Iraq and Syria, ISIS used mass-produced IEDs and landmines to target civilians, block access to infrastructure and farmland, and perpetrate their reign of terror long after the war ended. Basic services, which are key to people returning, were targeted specifically by ISIS. ISIS mined and booby-trapped critical infrastructure associated with the delivery of power, clean water, healthcare, education. A couple examples of this in the Nineveh Plains, the area that Katie spoke about. ISIS would deliberately blow down power lines and then lay mines around the base of those destroyed power towers that were holding up the power lines to specifically target the stabilization actors who were there to restore that power. Other things that were booby-trapped include water treatment stations, power stations, schools, hospitals, anything that would be required to help support the return of these communities. Homes. ISIS targeted people's homes deliberately. If refugees are lucky enough to have a home to return to after a conflict, landmines and booby traps can make repairing that home and moving back a very dangerous activity. Throughout Iraq, ISIS deliberately booby trapped homes. We've seen instances of ISIS booby trapping people's closets, children's toys, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, air conditioning units, water dispensers. The depravity is unimaginable that goes into some of the things that ISIS did. Additionally, we've seen a lot of booby trapping of homes on the outskirts of Tripoli, where the Russian-backed Wagner group has been responsible for laying booby traps and landmines. Lastly, I want to touch about economic opportunities. When refugees return, they need to be able to rebuild their lives, and to do that, they need to have a source of income. Explosive hazards block land for productive agricultural use, farming, animal husbandry, as well as factories, stores, and other spaces that are critical to economic development. Just a couple examples, Yazidi herders and farmers in the Nineveh Plains, factory workers in Mosul, medical staff in Ramadi, butchers and people who own businesses in Raqqa proper. None of these people were able to go back and restart their businesses, even if they had the will and the resources, until the bombs were cleared. So in order to support the voluntary return of displaced communities in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. scaled up support for demining and risk education activities. In FY17, the the Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement programmed $170 million in 1 year alone. A significant amount of this money went to our colleagues over at the Mines Advisory Group, as well as to other NGO implementing partners in country. This money allowed displaced communities to return to their homes. Enabling these communities isn't just about clearing mines. Rather, it's about identifying specific risks that various communities face and designing and implementing a risk mitigation or risk reduction strategy that fits that unique context. While the obvious end state is to clear all of the mines, there are things other than clearing mines, like risk education, surveying and marking minefields, that are a critical precursor to those more deliberate demining processes that are cost effective and can quickly help reduce casualties. Let's go back to Raqqa, Syria, for example, where, like I said, we had 179 landmine and ERW casualties in 1 month alone after the city was liberated. As a result of the risk mitigation strategy there, which involved explosive ordnance risk education, surveying and marking, and deploying a number of US funded teams to clear explosive ordnance in the city, we went from 179 casualties in December 2017 to just 13 casualties in June 2018. This was a huge success and helped a lot of people to move back to Raqqa. Another thing to mention about risk mitigation strategies is that it's important to consider sequencing, and especially in various local contexts. During our work in Iraq, our partners went into many places and they started working, and local leaders would approach them and say, hey, can you please prioritize clearing the school first? And the argument was, once you clear the school, children have a place to go during the day, which frees up parents to go out and earn a living and to rebuild their homes and their lives. And so many of our partners shifted to a model where, once the water and the power was turned on, the schools were the very next thing that they cleared, because we found that in that context, that is what it took to help people return to their communities. Now I'd like to turn my attention to the obviously very challenging situation in Ukraine that Simon just spoke about. First, let's talk a bit about the scope of the problem. At the end of 2021, the 8-year-long conflict with Russian-led forces had resulted in a line of contact between the Ukrainian government and Russia's proxies. There was significant amount of landmines laid along the line of contact, and in 2021 alone, there were 34 civilians killed and another 17 civilians injured by explosive hazards in eastern Ukraine. Those don't count any of the landmine-related casualties since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the early weeks, in the weeks and months before Russia's all-out invasion began in February, US-funded international demining NGOs were focused on evacuating staff and equipment to Western Ukraine while simultaneously providing digital risk education. These digital risk education efforts reached a significant number of Ukrainians. More recently, these NGOs have shifted their operational focus. As Simon mentioned, now that these teams are reconstituting themselves, our partners in country are focused on recruiting, reconstituting teams, re-equipping, training, and getting teams back out there to do the important work that they have decided to take on. They're working outside of Kiev and Chernihiv and mostly the central Ukraine area. Ukrainian authorities report destroying more than 26,000 explosive hazards in Kiev Oblast alone as of April 30th. That's 4 times the number of explosive hazards that PM's NGO implementing partners destroyed in the Donbass over a 4-year period. As Simon mentioned, the full-scale invasion has led to significant amount of contamination, both landmines and UXO, critical civilian infrastructure, including apartment blocks, hospitals, schools, food warehouses, power plants, roads, bridges, you name it. It's all been deliberately targeted by Russia's forces and destroyed. International demining experts estimate that Russian munitions may have a dud rate as high as 10 to 30%, meaning that massive amounts of explosive ordnance will remain on the ground for years to come. Additionally, Ukraine's Ministry of Agriculture estimates that approximately 10% of the country's farmland is now contaminated with explosive hazards. Unexploded ordnance, landmines, and other hazards will exacerbate global food insecurity by impacting Ukraine's food production and supply chain, block humanitarian aid workers from accessing Ukraine's hardest hit areas, and hinder the restoration of critical civilian infrastructure. Additionally, returning refugees will stream back into their communities that are contaminated and will unfortunately face dire consequences. Ukraine's national capacity to clear explosive remnants of war is stretched very thin. However, the government of Ukraine continues to do a very good job responding to threats as they come up. However, it's critical that both the government expand its efforts and that the international community surge support for demining NGOs. As of April 4th, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs estimated that approximately 80,000 square kilometers of land was suspected to be contaminated. This is an area approximately the size of West Virginia and Connecticut combined, and represents approximately 13% of Ukraine's total territory. A recent survey of more than 1,500 residents across 11 oblasts in central and eastern Ukraine found that approximately 40% of respondents had encountered one or more explosive remnants of war since the beginning of Russia's unprovoked and unlawful full-scale invasion. This is a staggering figure that truly drives home the significant amount of explosive hazard contamination that local communities and refugees are confronting now and will be forced to confront down the road. In sum, the problem as of today is as follows. Ukraine is currently dealing with more than 9 years worth of UXO and landmine contamination that started in 2014. More than 13% of the country's territory is reportedly contaminated. Approximately 10% of the farmland is contaminated. Local capacity is stretched thin. And finally, communities across the country are unable to return to their homes or rebuild their lives safely due to this contamination. Now let's talk a little bit about the US government's ongoing response. Prior to the 2022 invasion, the Department of State trained and equipped Ukraine's State Emergency Service demining teams that are now working tirelessly to address this threat. Since the start of the war, we've provided explosive ordnance disposal equipment to Ukraine's demining authorities and are committed to providing continued assistance and capacity building. Facilitating assistance delivery, preventing civilian explosive remnants of war casualties, and restoring farmland to productive use will require significant and urgent international response. Deploying US-funded demining teams will be essential to supplement Ukraine's existing national capacity to conduct area-wide surveys to locate explosive hazards and safely remove them. I should note that US-funded demining partners are already providing risk education, both in person and via social media, like I mentioned earlier, and that our funded partners are now redeploying teams as well as recruiting new staff. Concurrent train and equipping efforts are needed to expand Ukraine's enduring capacity. Helping Ukraine safely survey and clear unexploded ordnance and UXO is going to be a complex and difficult challenge. The United States and its implementing partners are currently scaling up support for this work. At a minimum, based on what we now know and comparable past operations, we predict that the international community will need to strengthen the explosive ordnance disposal of Ukraine's demining authorities, surge demining teams, both through NGOs and the government, and expand explosive ordnance risk education. In conclusion, while the conflict remains dynamic, it's difficult to estimate what it will take to address this problem completely. However, it's safe to say that resource requirements will be massive and the cleanup efforts will last many years. For context, and as I mentioned earlier, we programmed $170 million in 1 year alone in Iraq and Syria to support demining in 2017. In the Ukraine supplemental funding bill signed by President Biden last month, $100 million was authorized for the State Department to begin the effort to reduce contamination from landmines and UXO, in addition to addressing chemical, biological, and radiological threats. This $100 million is a very significant first step towards addressing this urgent challenge. Ukrainian authorities, demining organizations, and the broader stabilization community clearly have their work cut out for them. While Ukrainian expertise will be critical to addressing explosive hazard contamination, sustained international demining assistance in the form of training, equipment, and NGO teams that are able to survey, clear, and provide risk education will remain critical to enabling the delivery of basic services, ensuring that returning communities can rebuild their homes safely, and facilitating economic opportunities across the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saul. Appreciate it. And I'd now like to start the Q&A session. So if all three of our panelists are able to, please chime in if you have an answer to the questions. I'm going to start with the ones that are in the queue. If you are in the audience and you have a question, please feel free to type it in there and we'll see how many we can get to. The first one is, how do landmine clearance organizations in Iraq work with other humanitarian organizations to support refugees? Does USAID come rapidly behind the State Department to fund housing and other services once the land is cleared, or do these efforts exist in silos?
Answer that. Okay, so there are a few different ways that we collaborate with other humanitarian actors, and it's mostly in support of internally displaced persons rather than in response to the refugees from Syria. So the first thing that, and is probably the most effective way, especially for the smaller scale projects, is just on the ground collaboration. MAG has community liaison teams who go to local coordination meetings and also just meet with other NGOs working in the area. And this is a really good way where we're able to make sure that our work is benefiting them to the extent possible, given requirements for tasking from the national authorities. Another thing is specifically tasking from the national authorities. A couple of the examples I've mentioned, such as in Dogri and the clearance of an ICRC, or the survey of an area for an ICRC water pipe project, those were those tasks were given to us by the national authorities. So the UN Habitat and the ICRC had approached them. In other cases, we've had ad hoc requests coming to us from the Department of State and USAID. In particular, in Nineveh Plains, there's a village of Batnaya, and because of the COVID pandemic, we had some tasks that had been suspended in the area. So we heard from the State Department that some of the USAID partners who are working in this area wanted to work in the area where the suspended task was, and then also in extensions of that area. So we were able to collaborate that way. There's also sometimes people approach us at the head office level, based, in Erbil and in Baghdad. We're also sort of looking at ways where we could make maybe have more formal partnerships. This was something that somebody mentioned as a point for discussion at a strategy workshop we recently had with other mine action actors and the national authorities. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It sometimes can be a little bit more siloed than we like, but we also have lots of good examples of successful collaboration through a few different channels.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Our next question is, what kind of equipment is needed to clear the explosives you are seeing in Ukraine? Can the same detectors and other resources be used for both landmines and other bombs? Are you getting equipment from DoD?
So thanks for that. And so we at Halo have a long-standing relationship with Department of Defense, working on developing methods and means of clearing explosive ordnance and landmines. And there are actually a number of different, particularly with regard to mechanical clearance, digging up anti-tank mines or tilling the soil to bring them to the surface. A number of different systems that we've actually trialed as part of that partnership with Department of Defense in, for instance, in places like Afghanistan, that will be extremely useful in Ukraine. And so we are utilizing, lessons learned as a result of our work with Department of Defense, but also, as a result of things that we've learned as a result of our support from US State Department. And in terms of detectors, we're already using what we call large loop detectors that look a bit like bed frames that two people walk through a field to find particularly metal cased anti-tank mines. And we've got particular types of bomb locators for finding deeper buried ordnance. So yeah, we are getting the equipment that we need, and but we're still in a process of survey, of identifying, exactly what the nature of the threat is that the Russians have left behind, and how best to address that in terms of the terrain, etc. So I think yeah, we're getting what we need, and the nature of the response has been fantastic, particularly from the US government, and that means I'm pretty confident that we will get the right equipment in there if it's not already on its way.
Okay, let's see. Next one is back to Iraq. Were there any unique challenges in terms of removing unexploded ordnance in Iraq that made it more or less challenging than other contexts?
I'll do my best to answer this one, but I am going to caveat it with the fact that I'm somebody who sits in a nice air-conditioned office, and I'm not out in the field in the 100 plus, last week it was 114 degree heat, actually doing the clearance myself. But there are a few, not 100%, but somewhat different aspects we face. To start off, in our Kurdistan region, where we have conventional weapons, conventional mines, a lot of the areas, it's a very mountainous region. And so we face issues where mines may migrate down the mountain, especially in the winter when there's a lot of snow and rain. And so they can be displaced, and we often we can't use the mechanical assets on a lot of the mountains. We end up using them in the gullies where the migrated mines go to. Also, obviously, when we had this new contamination left by ISIS, that required a lot of new training and bringing in people with experience in clearing IEDs. Saul mentioned the different ways that houses were booby-trapped, and how just any part of a house could be dangerous, whether it's a light switch or your front doorstep or the faucet. And so we ended up setting up, we call it the House of Horrors, in our training school to train people in how to clear these sorts of buildings. We're also doing a lot more clearance in urban areas and buildings where there can be secondary hazards. So you have to worry about the structural stability of the building. We also, as mentioned before, these are IEDs, so they're much larger than conventional landmines, and they also can be triggered much more easily than, say, an anti-vehicle mine. So they're a lot more dangerous in that sense. They have different types, tripwires and pressure plates that can set them off, and even a very, it doesn't take much to set them off. So they can be very dangerous. Also, we found that despite we do try our best with explosive ordnance risk education, but because of people's need to use the land, or because MAG just hadn't been able to get in to do risk education before, when the area was not yet secured, people had started doing sort of self-help clearance, but it's not being done systematically. There aren't records, and they might have removed parts of an improvised mine while the main charge and the detonator were still there. So it's not done to international standards. So I'm sure our technical staff would probably highlight more things, but those are a few of the things that I can think of. And then there are some other, environmental factors as well, as I mentioned, with the heat and the mountains.
If I might just make a quick observation, I mean, I remember being in Syria and Kobani in 2015 and seeing very large numbers of improvised explosive devices of similar to the ones that MAG are finding and that Halo are finding in further south in Iraq, and then being in Fallujah in 2017 and seeing very large numbers of IEDs of exactly the same design. So 650 kilometers apart, we're seeing mass-produced IEDs to a common design. So almost kind of industrial levels of production of IEDs, which was something that was, I thought, very striking. Over.
Okay, thank you both. Our next question kind of is a follow-up for Saul's presentation. It says, given states experience programming 100+ million for a single year for Iraq and the needs in Ukraine now, what is state strategy for programming the funding made available by the Ukraine supplemental?
Hey, thanks, Laura, and thanks for that question. Before I get to that, if I could just add something to the response to the first question about the interagency approach. Depending on the context, coordination will always happen a little differently. So I think Syria and Iraq provide two really good examples. In Syria, the UN was unwilling to work in areas that were not controlled by the government. Therefore, the US, the State Department and USAID essentially set up their own stabilization system with local authorities where state and USAID would meet with locals. We would go down a list about what was mined, what was slated for, what critical infrastructure was slated for restoration, and then our teams would coordinate, deconflict, and make sure that the demining teams that we funded through our contractor went to those sites, cleared those sites, reported back to USAID, and then USAID's folks would go out and restore those as soon as they were cleared. That is one example of how that works at a very local level. Iraq was a little different because the international community decided to pitch in, and UN stood up the FFS, the Funding Facility for Stabilization, where lots of donors pitched in money for stabilization efforts. There was a prioritized list. We were able to then share that prioritized list with our contractor who would deploy teams to each of those sites. So it wasn't us coordinating directly with USAID in this context, but with UNDP, who was receiving a huge amount of money from USAID. So the coordination does take place. It'll just happen at a different level depending on the context of the response. To the question about Ukraine, I'd like to start by just thanking everyone on the Hill for that generous pot of money in the second supplemental package. The working plan right now, it's a kind of four-pronged approach. The first prong is to work with our colleagues in Ukraine to help them develop a new humanitarian demining training center. Second prong of that approach is to train and equip government demining teams. Third is to ramp up support for our NGO partners from the organizations who you're on the call with now, your HALOs, your MAGs, the other organizations doing this important and dangerous work. And the final prong is to continue to provide the support to Ukrainian mine action authorities that they need to both oversee and manage information associated with mine action. While all the important stuff that the NGOs and local deminers do in the field is critical, if the data associated with that isn't captured in a central database, the government is unable to tell people what's safe, what's not safe, what roads can you take, what roads should you not take. And so we're going to be targeting some of that institutional support at providing people to help Ukrainian government authorities with that information management. And more details should be coming soon. We are in the process of finalizing the CNs and the spend plans now, and it's a slog as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Sal. I think we have time for one last very quick question. This one is back to Simon. It says, Simon mentioned that 60% of casualties in Ukraine are being caused by anti-tank mines. Is that 60% of total casualties, including military or just civilian?
So that's recorded civilian casualties. At the moment, it's quite hard to access the information. And so I wouldn't say that was necessarily, absolutely kind of gospel, because I think there's a lot of unreported casualties out there. But I think in terms of the percentages, it pretty much chimes with what I saw. Of course, what may happen in the east is a whole different thing. I mean, what was striking about the areas around Kyiv and up towards Chernihiv and etc. is that the Russians didn't stay for very long, so they didn't build elaborate defenses. They laid anti-tank mines, and of course they shelled these areas before they moved through them, or they may have shelled as they moved away. But we didn't see very, very technically elaborate defenses. Now, that may be something that we'll see a lot more of in the east, in the Donbass, if those areas, of course, become available to clear. And given that our staff mostly come from those areas, they're keen to get back there. So, yeah, at the moment, 60% of civilian casualties that we've been able to record, a lot of it through open source data gathering. So there's a lot more work to be done to hone that down, but I think they're pretty indicative.
Thank you. I think it's time for us to wrap up. So I want to say a big thank you to Katie, Simon, and Saul for your very insightful and timely presentations today. Just such hard work going on, that great to hear the details of. And I want to say a big thank you to HALO and to MAG for the important work that you guys are doing in Iraq, Ukraine, and numerous other countries across the globe. So for our congressional staff, if your boss is interested in learning more about the UXO Demining Caucus or interested in joining, please reach out to me or also to Kate Adams with Congresswoman Spear. So thank you, everybody, and we will wrap it up.